What's been the biggest difference for you between Amman and the last place you were, and then even, I guess, and the place before that?
It was Arlington, Baltimore, Cairo, Amman. And all three were like, all four, sorry, were like very different from each other, I think. Arlington, I was there in the pandemic. I was doing grad school at GW and I was living basically alone. My flatmates had gone back to their home state. It was a really sterile state. It made me think a lot about urban design and like relationship with land in terms of what structures are made, the reason they're made, the material they're made from. There's this one part of Arlington, right when you cross the bridge from DC, it's suddenly like tall buildings. It's just really mechanical. You drive like 10 minutes straight and you're at the Pentagon. Baltimore, I always think of it as like a ghost town. I moved there when I was like 11 from Kuwait, but I've never considered myself to be like from Baltimore, so I feel like I never have the right to talk about it. The only impression I ever really feel comfortable saying that I have of Baltimore is that it's just like a ghost town in a lot of ways. Cairo is a big city, it's a dense city, it's a killer city. I think it has increasingly turned into something unrecognizable to me. Since I'm from Cairo, my dad's from Cairo, it's been getting more and more difficult to like go back to, I think. Which is really tragic for me because that was the place that I thought, I would move back to. I went to undergrad there and I was like, this is it. Like, I'm not leaving Cairo. Like, this is my home. And then bad the last 4 or 5 years, I just feel like I don't know what I'm looking at anymore. And Amman was a city that I never thought I would actually like. Because, like everyone talks so much shit about it. When I made the decision to come to Amman, it was mostly out of like the friends I had here. And since I was coming from like a state of like extreme grief, I wanted a place that was so quiet. All I could do was hear silence. And I think Amman is a really good resting point. It definitely feels like the kindest city I've been in like a while.
You went from Arlington and mostly spending your time alone, and now you've made it to Amman, where a lot of the people you love are. And does that change your relationship to places for you?
Oh, completely. Like 1000%, 1000%. I think about this actually more with Ramallah than like any other city. Because I've never been to Ramallah, but there's like a lot of people that I love there. And so I think in terms of maybe work, because I feel like I center Ramallah as like a very focal location in a lot of the poetry that I have been working on recently. And I feel like I've been using it more as a representation of something else because of how many dimensions I think it carries in my head. I think, in terms of physical cities that I've been inhabiting, there was definitely like a shift in the people I wanted around me. I think the grief that I am in has felt like really violent. And for me, it felt like something that could be best understood in this landscape and the people in this landscape. And so for me, it was just like a way to make my grief more compatible and understanding. Because I think in Cairo, like the sense of grief that exists there and that's been collective there isn't the grief that I was raised in. So when it came time for me to like mourn my brother, returning into this landscape with a grief that I was raised in, it's what made the grief easier to process.
I'm wondering if maybe you feel comfortable talking more about it, but you're referring to like being raised in grief, and you're also going through a period of really intense grief right now. What does it mean for you to have been raised in grief? And what does that look like when also carrying the grief that you are right now?
I was always raised in this community notion that the grief that we experience is something we all experience. And so it was bigger than just yourself as an individual. And I feel like a lot of it was this kind of grief that was allowed to take like multiple manifestations. Like your grief as a Palestinian could be different than my grief as a Palestinian, but Sitnainhum are both like extremely valid. It's my mom that's Palestinian, right? And I think adding on all of the structures and institutions that come with Arab womanhood,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and the grief that's like really like alive in that, and being raised in that frame within like a Palestinian community, come on, like in Kuwait. I don't know, like I think it just made grief just like a very common thing. And it was something that just became both natural and something that I was desensitized to in a way. How does it interact with the grief I have now? No grief is truly unique in its most reduced form. Because I'm not the first sister who lost her brother. But like under the circumstances that I lost him and the relationship that we had when we were both alive, that's what was unique. And I think that that's like the thing that I definitely mourn the most. I'm really like not the first person. Like my parents aren't the first parents to lose a child. None of it was a unique situation. The pictures that we see of like violence in Palestine, like I don't think it has to always be a gun at a checkpoint or like a boy throwing a stone.
Hmm.
You know, you can also talk about like the actual like mental and emotional and like psychological effects of growing up under occupation, where that takes you and like who what kind of situations you enter in أكتر than just your community but like نفسك. And I think like my brother was no exception to the situation he was in.
I mean, is loneliness something that you've been coping with as you move through this grief? And does this like recognition of not being the only one, is that something that's been helping you with that?
I think there was a point in like the first month of grief that I felt extremely lonely. And it didn't matter like how many of my friends were like by my side. It didn't matter how genuine the love was. None of it mattered. But then it was like, but what do you understand like about my grief? You don't know the relationship I lost. Like you don't know what my brother lost, like what my family lost.
Mm,
Like the way even that I see it is different than the way my parents see it or the way my other brother sees it. Like all of us I think have really individualized perspectives on it. You know, my parents pointed out Marra that every one of us had a very different relationship with Yusuf. And so none of us could actually understand the other person's grief. You know, the people in my immediate family can't understand my grief is like losing my older brother. Who in my life can tell me? But what did help, one of the things, was knowing that my grief wasn't alone.
something that came up for me as you were describing this and talking about how your grief is yours and your relationship with him was your relationship with him. And so now, as you process this, and now as you're taking that in, how have you felt your relationship with yourself changing, since that's kind of, I feel like it has to be internalized in some way and an effect of that.
Suddenly, like it went from life was like so loud and so ringing and so big, like way bigger than I could handle, to me being able to just stare at it. And it wasn't anything terrifying anymore.
Mm.
So I think it just became a lot calmer. I think it became a lot quieter. I think it became, in a lot of ways, a search for mercy. What I really wanted to take away from everything wasn't like the big moments, but it suddenly became very focused on having sweet days and small moments. And I definitely believe we are realized in increments, right? Like you don't wake up and know yourself immediately. So I suddenly think I became a lot more patient. Everything that felt unnecessary kind of dissolved. And then it became like a grounding force for me. Something would happen and I would suddenly have this urge, and it would just feel like very material to just like scream. And then I just like would remember my brother, and then suddenly I could just realize how small this thing was compared to how big that thing was. And then I think life became a lot more clarified, simplified. When life and death became more than hypothetical, when it became more than a theory, when it became more than like a news article or a headline, but became something I was waking up and living with, it changed me in like a lot of ways that I like still don't understand. And I've been doing my best to like move through, I guess, understanding it, understanding vulnerability, and trying to not just process grief, but process. I don't know if I want to say who I am on the other side of grief because I don't think there is another side to grief. I don't think there's a bridge you cross and then it's done. I think you cross the bridge when you die.
Mm, mm,
I guess who I am in a way where grief is not so hungry every day.
mm,
I think what it really did was that it made me able to swallow fear, I think, more easily than I had before.
That kind of reminds me of when looking at trauma and how there's kind of that frame of it's not that you're going to ever eradicate your triggers necessarily, but rather you really want to get familiar with them, the way that you cope with them, or the way that we react or respond when they come up. That is what we end up having control over.
I think a lot of it is about accepting that you can't control most of the things you're going to go through.
Have your hopes for yourself shifted?
I think it just continues to fall back into the increments thing where I
Mhm.
want to build my joy, my sense of love on my own terms, on my own basis, in my own space. I just kind of began to trust like the process. I just wake up and like try.
Yeah, it sounds closer to a way of being than a way of doing or wanting. Grief is big, and I think that we've been in a time of perpetual grief this past year. It's felt like it's not ending, and it's almost been a year of us living in pandemic times. I think that at this point, it's become quite normalized as grief tends to become there is not really any other choice but to live in a way in which you're surviving. We've lost so much. And in this case, it's so many things. We've lost connection, we've lost people.
But did you feel that way in the beginning, like when it first began?
Yeah, when it first began, that's really when I think the loss was feeling most potent. But then after a while, it feel like it became an opportunity or a chance to reimagine things, maybe trying to bring it back to some of the other topics that we were talking about. How does our relationship with Palestinian identity look like for each of us? In terms of grief, one of the things that kind of I think about is it's kind of funny, the grief unfolds over time, and it has me thinking a lot about what you were saying about how you don't get over grief. It's something we carry with us, and I think it's the same thing for you. There's so many sides to it, so you don't even see the whole thing at once, and it's kind of the same thing I think of in this particular dynamic. We don't always know the things that we've lost. I don't know if that ever hits you sometimes. This kind of, for me, goes back to like a way of being or a way of living. What do we know to grieve? Like, what do we even know that we lost? I don't know. I think a lot of people talk about what could have beens and whatnot, but I think it's a lot more than that too.
I feel like I've been focused so much on the conception of reimagining. I feel like I want all the space. Like I want all the space to just have fluidity into what it means to be Palestinian and into how I see myself and how I understand myself as an individual, as a Palestinian. I don't think there's an algorithm that we exist in. I don't think there's anything that negates a person or whatever from being Palestinian. I think you just wake up and you are. Ask me what I think of when I think of being Palestinian. I think the thing that I think most about is connection to land. It's not that we're just from the land, but it's that we're for the land,
Mm.
which I think ties back a lot into like what I've been thinking lately about urban design and architecture, how we then like interact with the world around us in terms of being able to rest, not wanting to die under like capitalism, the ability to just breathe, the way that affects love and how one loves and the processes of it, and how you see mercy and how you see everything else. I think that that's all built through landscape. Landscape as like a construct and raising someone and like raising a community. I don't know how much I see Palestine in a sense of grief anymore. From the grief came bitterness, and it became a lot of anger, and it began to just feel like a curse. And then it just became like a lot of love. And
Mm.
when I began to understand myself as a Palestinian, present tense, a lot of it was through love as like a verb and like as a constant making.
I love that you brought that up, and especially this idea of love and futuring and reimagining and relationship to land and place. But It's not all about grieving.
I think if it was, it would just be so stressful.
If it was, me and you wouldn't be friends.
What would we do?
Because I mean, I guess maybe I can talk about that a little bit. My feelings about our relationship and some of the ways in which we've connected, a lot of the things that really like sustain and also built our relationship and like it's felt very natural and fluid, but it's been on this basis of poetry and literature and making arts and sharing more or less our visions. I think that me and you both play a lot with memory and reimagined memory and how memory from the past informs our futures. And this kind of brings me back to like what you're hopeful for or your sense of hope has changed. These are the types of things that make me quite hopeful personally, is the ways in which we're able to take a lot of our what may have been anger or bitterness or confusion. From there, it feels like on my end, and especially, but a lot of the ways in which I sustain my hope is through my creative practice. And having someone like you who also is constantly developing your creative practice. I mean, it's changed so much since I've known you, and I think vice versa. Both of us have grown so much as artists.
My favorite thing about our relationship that I mentioned earlier, like before we started recording, was how we're able to have conversations in silence and in visual. I definitely think we've watched and supported each other grow like over the years. You definitely provided a lot of frames in my life that I didn't know how to hold otherwise. I think the love that we have for each other and the relationship that we have for each other is definitely something that pushes me towards hope for a better tomorrow. When you asked me like what hopes do I have for myself, and it wasn't anything material. I was just reaching more into into an easier sense of being. Where were you when we met? Physically, emotionally, like whatever.
All of the above. We were in DC and it was kind of absurd. I was there for some networking event and our mutual friend had organized it. And I remember that she had definitely raved about you quite a bit before I met you. And I had already been fangirling you a little bit before we met. And then we did, and just I think that I really appreciated how quick you were to just call out Arab Americans for being how we are sometimes. I mean, we have to be able to take some criticism now and again if we really want to like be working towards these futures we talk about. Though you brought up some like really great points, and I think this even makes me think a little bit about this topic of going back to like what our relationships with Palestine are. I think that we have to be more open about where we actually are. You were talking a lot about like how kind of tired you were of the performativity that you felt like you were experiencing around a lot of Arab Americans. How are you supposed to connect with someone if the whole time you're just trying to perform an identity that you just are?
Because that's what I was talking about when I was talking about like how being Palestinian, it's not an algorithm, it's not a box.
Hmm.
And I think both sides are guilty of this. But Anna, like what was really irritating to me was constantly meeting people and your entire personality being reduced into your ethnicity. And that to me was like mind-blowingly weird. And then it was even weirder having people try and seek like a validity form from me.
I think, especially in an American context, I think that there's something to say about how you're racialized in the US as well. I think a lot more people feel like they have to carry that identity first and foremost with them because of in the US, the ways that you can be perceived in different spaces. I think we need to encourage people to like get out of these comfort zones that are hollow of performativity and then put these other spaces where rather we're not having this conversation of, oh, I'm more Arab than you, oh, I'm more this than you, but rather how are we going to honor where we came from and use that towards where we're going. And for me, I think right now that's where my relationship with being Palestinian is at. This is the history that brought me into this moment. And that is part of my history, but it's one part. And being able to uncover that with other people, I think is really beautiful as well. This is kind of like where reimaginings can happen too. And maybe also the like flip side of that point I made about what do we know to grieve, but also what do we know to build?
When I started reading Tad Adnan a few years ago,
Mm.
and I started thinking about landscapes and like how that raises us, was definitely a return into the question of ancestors and like the placement of them. I don't feel displaced in a lot of ways. I feel like waking up and existing and being in the region is doing that work in like some ways.
Did you feel displaced when you were in Arlington and or Baltimore?
I felt so displaced.
Yeah.
I felt so uncomfortable. And like in every way. I knew that I'd felt foreign in America. I knew I felt like an alien complex in America. But then it really irritated me all of the micro things that I couldn't get. The little socialisms like I didn't understand. Gained the imposter syndrome complex where I was like, okay, because my foundational years were in such a different space. It was really stressful for me to gain confidence again. You know, like in Kuwait, I understood myself as a Palestinian in Kuwait. And like to me that made sense because of the collective history there. Being Palestinian in America, being Arab in America, being anything, just existing in America was like really traumatic for me personally. Like
Mhm.
I did not enjoy it.
Have there been spaces, moments, or flashes of what could be, or like places that you did feel like you belonged?
LA was a city that I connected with instantly. I think really truly it's landscapes. The fact that it felt so similar to Palestine in terms of landscape made it really easy for me to feel comfortable in myself, my surroundings, and the community. وكل إشي. And I think that that's why landscapes is like a theme that I consistently return into and want to understand more. I truly do believe in landscapes as being one of the main factors in how I navigate selfhood.
So I think I have a good wrap-up question. As long as we're talking about, kind of like legacy and future building and things like that, I guess if there was something that you were going to teach your children about moving through the world as they are, what are some of the things that you would wish to impart onto them?
I think just be like the river, which I think involves a lot of fluidity. I think it involves accepting and understanding temporalities. I think it involves really understanding your place in the land and your relationship with the land. There's a poem. What I want from the river is what I always want, to be held by a stronger thing that in the end chooses mercy. So I don't think I want my kids to be so stressed about identity. No matter where they're raised or what space they choose or whatever, yani, I think it really has to do a lot with river, mercy, temporary, love, and then don't forget to breathe.
Mm, I love those, especially mercy.
I think the mercy is definitely a big one.
Hmm.
I think a lot of it stems from my mom. She used to tell us a story when she was growing up. She like passed a shop one day in Erbil when she was a teenager, and there was some ayah from the Quran, and it was talking about don't walk on the land with arrogance and to always be light-footed and kind. And I think that was the original flowering of that for me.
I think that I would really hope to also be able to try and instill this sense of to not feel like you have to prove an identity to anybody but yourself for whatever that's worth or whatever that means to you. The other thing I think is something that I wish that I had more respect for earlier and that I'm really only learning now. And I think I kind of already, and I've been mentioning this word legacy a lot, but as much as you possibly can, to try and take a little bit of time to learn the histories of the things which motivate us and which interest us and which we feel a calling to or a passion for. I think what that does is this helps you tap into the sense of community of things. And I also think this goes back to even some of the things you were talking about, how there's a lot of things that you're not alone in, and to be open to all the ways an experience can be held. And I would really hope that they would understand how important that is for thinking of things in a more inclusive sense, and in the sense of this is really where radical imaginations come from. It's not something that we just came up with. It's an accumulation, and this I think also goes to some of the points you're making about increments and how there isn't a big climax, but rather it's a process to try our best to be patient with process, but also to really honor there's a lot that gets us to the places that we are.
I think the only perception that matters is yourself. Everyone has their own distinct perception, and I just don't think it's worth it to let other people's eat you. I think we just consistently return into spots we have to close.
Mm-hmm. The return. You just brought up returns. What a great way to end. Well, it's been so nice to have a conversation with you.
Thank you so much for giving us the space to talk out loud.